This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Outreach specialist in grain storage and feed manufacturing at the IGP Institute at K-State, Carlos Campabadal, kicks off today's show with reminders about proper grain storage. The show continues with the speaker from K-State's Beef Stalker Field Day who talked about coccidiosis. Senior veterinarian with Huvepharma, Joe.dedrickson, describes its life cycle and treatment. From the latest K-State Garden Hour, K-State Woody Ornamental Specialist Jason Griffin ends the show discussing a few of the conifer studies that have been conducted at the John C. Pear Horticulture Research Center. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about grain storage with outreach specialist in grain storage and feed manufacturing at the IGP Institute at K-State, Carlos Campabadal. Carlos, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby, for the opportunity, and be more than happy to share information to all our farmers and ranchers that get our message here.
Carlos, what are some things that need to be done before we even think about storing grain?
Well, that's always a very important question. And one of the things that I always like to tell our farmers and ranchers and people in the co-ops is to get ready. Harvest season is coming, for fall crops. And the best way to take care of your grain, no matter which one you're storing, and soybeans, of course, is to prepare for it. What I will say that you have to prepare for it is that first, it's very important to do maintenance in your bins. Be sure that your fans are working, the loading equipment is working. There's no any holes or leaks, anything like that could get moisture inside, because that could cause a lot of problems. And then thinking about that afterwards is very important to clean your bins, because go inside in a safe way, of course, having somebody spotting you and everything. Be sure to have any type of communication device to, once somebody goes in, to communicate, and be sure, of course, that no equipment is running, lock out, tag out. After you go in, clean it. Try to remove any leftover grain, dust, any type of residue from whatever was stored previously, because you don't want to keep any old grain or old soybeans staying there, because more likely they will spoil faster. And if that happens, then if mold grows there, it will go to the next grain coming in after harvest. Also be sure that if you see any insects, especially the insects that attack grain, it could be a primary or secondary pest, be sure to apply an approved insecticide that you could put on empty structures, and it is approved for the grain that you're going to be storing there during the harvest. So thinking about that, be sure to have it clean. Apply an insecticide if you see anything. Be sure that there's no leaks, that there's no moisture coming in, and then you'll be ready for putting anything that you want to store for a specific amount of time.
Carlos, as we're thinking about putting our crops into the bin, really, what does their moisture content need to be?
Well, so, here around this area, thinking about corn, for example, you will have to dry it. People use their artificial dryers and just to lower the moisture to the right level. When we safe storage moisture content, we're looking for all conditions throughout the year below 15%, between 14, 15%. Usually the trade of the moisture content for corn is around there, and it's because of a reason, because that's the level that we know that we could keep the corn stored in this area for a good period of time. For soybeans, it's a little bit less. It's around 12%, and that's just because of the nature of the soybeans. They have oil inside that if there's a crack or something, they could go rancid and cause some other issues. But it's just the tendency of the type of grain it is. So soybeans, usually you let them dry in the field. But what is important is to, once you get your corn dried, some people might not, depending where they're located, might just want to go a couple points higher just to save some fuel in that dryer, and then put it inside your silo or your bin, turn on the aeration fans, and help cool down that grain that comes with heat from the dryer. And that air, as it absorbs that heat, will become a dryer, actually, that heated air, and can pull a couple more moisture point. So that saves you energy and, of course, fuel and can get you to the right level. If you don't have the capacity of that, since one, I will call it blessing, to be honest, that we have here in the Midwest is that when you harvest grain, fall crops, temperatures will go down. And one key thing to maintain grain, any type of grain, wheat, sorghum, corn, and of course also soybeans and even canola and any other crop, is to have it as cool as possible. So for whatever reason, if you cannot dry that moisture all the way down to 16% and then put in the bin, or all the way to 15%, 14%, you can also keep it a little bit, not as high, but you could keep it to 18% for a couple months, but then be sure to always dry it, because you don't want to keep that once spring hits, temperature starts going up, or something happens during the winter, that especially now that we get some warmer temperatures, we don't want that grain to be exposed to any type of warm weather, because then that will cause insects to feel more comfortable if they're there, and of course mold to start going and then spoiling that grain.
And how does grain quality differ from when it goes into when it comes back out?
I always joke, but it is sure. It always, the answer is it will depend. And I say this every time I do an extension or a teaching presentation or any conference, that the quality of the grain or soybeans will never improve during storage. Our role as a farmer or a rancher or an operator in an elevator is to maintain it as good as we receive it. Being said that, if we do a good job preparing for that grain in that bin, and then we maintain through the good conditions of aerating it, keeping insects out by applying some insecticide, you get an infestation, maybe fumigating it. But of course, in cold weather, you usually don't get that. That quality will be as very close to how we receive it. And that should be the goal of it. Of course, nothing beat the quality as freshly harvested grain to compare a couple months later, but that's the goal that we need to always aim.
Do they need to check in on their bins and silos throughout the year, or once it's closed, it's good to go?
Well, I recommend to keep an eye on it. Of course, two things you could do. You could, I will not tell you to go in, but open the lid on the top. If you smell something is wrong, sour, musty, there's an issue there. And then, of course, as much as possible, have temperature cables. Temperature cables are thermocouples that give you a good idea of what is the condition of the grain by measuring its temperature. So if that temperature of that grain starts going up and it's cold outside, more likely you're going to have an issue. Probably is going to be an insect infestation, which is very unlikely due to the temperatures after harvest in the fall and winter, but also mold growth. So at any time of the year, temperature cables can give you a good idea of what's going on, because if you start seeing that temperature increase, that's more likely an indicator that there's an issue with it, and go do something about it.
Can producers accidentally store their grain for too long?
Well, that's always very good question. And I will say you could keep your grain for actually a lot of time, but you have to be on top of it. Taking samples, checking if there's any odor, be sure that you store it at the right moisture when it comes in, checking the temperature with the grain temperature cables. And that could get you, if you do the right thing of aeration, cooling that grain down, and not aerating when it's warm, because then you introduce heat. You could keep it for a year, even longer. Of course, the idea is not to. The idea is to kind of empty your bins before the next harvest. But a good 9 months, 12 months, you could still do it. But you always have to keep an eye on it and do the right practices for it.
Carlos, we've obviously been talking about bins and silos, but any comments when it comes to bag storage?
There's different things that people are doing, of course. You talk about silo bags, which are very similar to silage bags that we used for forages for feeding cattle. But silo bags, if you do that, you have to keep in mind that they are temporary storage, meaning that it's something that you're going to dispose later, and there's not the barrier between the grain and the outside conditions is less compared to just a metal bin or a concrete bin or something like that. So you have to be more careful, because more likely that outer layer of grain next to that plastic will have a similar conditions to the environmental. The good thing about grain and soybeans is that they're good insulators. So that heat that if it's outside will take longer to transmit inside the grain mass unless you have an issue like mold or insects. If you do outer grain piles, which is also very common, more as an elevator level, it will be the same thing. You have to do your aeration, you have to take care of it, but you have to know that there's going to be some spoilage because you're literally putting it outside just with a cover, a tarp, or in a bag.
Carlos, any final thoughts for farmers, ranchers, producers when it comes to grain storage?
Key thing, always try to keep your grain as cool as possible. The cooler it is, the longer it will last. And of course, if you start seeing any issues with it, try to move the grain, or if you can't, then of course try to always look what the issue will be. If there's mold, turn on your fans, get that smell out. If you have some insects, maybe try to do something about it. But at the end of the day, my message is always try to maintain the quality as good as you get it from harvest, and also be safe when you do it. Don't risk any injury, don't risk anything just to kind of go inside a grain bin. It's always safer to do it from outside as much as possible.
Carlos, if people have any grain storage questions, can they reach out to you?
Absolutely. Part of my role here at the IGP Institute and my faculty position at the Department of Grain Science and Industry is to do extension. And of course, anybody could reach me out on my email, which is campa@ksu.edu, or just call my office phone, 785-532-3187.
Carlos, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby, for the opportunity, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions of anybody at any time.
That was Outreach Specialist in Grain Storage and Feed Manufacturing at the IGP Institute at K-State, Carlos Campabadal. I will link his contact information in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about coccidiosis with a senior veterinarian with Huvepharma, Joe Dedrickson. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Joe, you recently spoke at the K-State Beefstalker Unit Field Day, and your conversation was on coccidiosis. And can you remind us about what is coccidiosis?
Yeah. It's a parasite that affects cattle as well as multiple other animals, but they're very host-specific. The cattle one only affect cattle. It's a parasite, but it's different than worms. It's a single-celled protozoan that grows in the individual cell in the intestine of cattle. With that, it affects their ability to absorb nutrients, so you lose feed efficiency, you lose weight gain, you lose performance. And then a side effect of this parasite is it causes immunosuppression. So that cuts down on an animal's ability to respond to other diseases, including respiratory disease.
And this can really have quite a financial impact on the cattle industry, not just beef cattle.
Yes. They estimate for the total industry in published things $400 million annually. My perception is that was done back when calves were worth $1 a pound, so that figure may be much higher than that. Yeah.
And sometimes when we think about coccidiosis, we think about bloody diarrhea, but that's not really the only thing. You've also mentioned immunosuppression.
Yes. Several years ago, we did an analysis. What we did is looked at all the good published studies on mange and coccidia, and that was with all the drugs from all the companies. One of the things we noticed in going through that is every study that we had good control of coccidia, we had a reduction in respiratory disease. It wasn't always statistically significant, but there was a numeric reduction. And this is why we went to Dr. Roth at Iowa State University, and he has a immune function test that he can measure what your immune function is, and he did that with coccidia and found that even subclinical calves look normal, but they have a few parasites growing in them, they still suppress the immune system.
And even if they doesn't look like they have effects, every cow has some coccidia in them?
Yeah, there is no such thing as a calf or a cow or a steer, whatever, that doesn't have some level. That doesn't mean they have a disease level that's causing that. But we did a study actually in some large pastures in eastern South Dakota here several years ago, and we monitored cows and calves from the time they went to pasture in May till they come off in the fall. And 100% of those calves were all positive, which I use that example because if there's ever a place you should not see any cocci, it'd be there, but yet they still were all positive.
When it comes to this parasite, what is the life cycle?
The life cycle is pretty unique in comparison to all other parasites. It has an asexual phase in the small intestine. And what that means is the organism just divides over and over and over. And that single egg, which has 4 spore cysts in it with the individual sporozoites, so there's 8 of those larvae or sporozoites in an individual egg. Each one of them will develop into 120,000 merozoites, another form of larvae, and then each one of them goes into a second division about 20 times. So all of a sudden you take one egg and you have 15 million larvae in that, and that animal will look normal because those larvae go in and out of cells with virtually causing no damage. And average feedlot steer, they estimate, will pick up 25,000 of those eggs a day. I don't know about you, but I don't even know what 25,000 times 15 million is. Yeah.
So, Joe, is there a phase within it that a medicine or something could work to calm down coccidiosis in livestock or cattle?
We're very fortunate in livestock. We have 5 different products available from multiple companies, and they will shut down various stages of the life cycle. Their end result is they stop the coccidia from growing and, of course, increase your immune system and increase your feed efficiency. Yeah.
Joe, can you tell us just a little bit about those different products from different companies?
Oh, yeah. We're very fortunate. At Muriel, we have 2 of those products. One is Corid, which active ingredient is amprolium. It's unique in that we have feed-grade forms and we have water-soluble forms, which have a treatment claim. So we actually can use it both for preventing and treating. And then Fibro has 2 products that work also. One of them is Bovatec and the other is Decox. Decox is a prevention drug that goes into feed only, and Bovatec is an ionophore that not only goes into feed to help control coccidia, it also has ionophore activity, increased amount of energy available per pound of feed. And then your last products are Monovet, our product, and Elanco's Rumensin. The active ingredient is monensin. It's another ionophore that allows you to get a little higher dose. You get complete prevention as well as minimal control.
You've mentioned words like control, prevention, treatment. What do those words mean to producers?
Well, if you're like me, I use control and prevention interchangeably for a lot of years. But the way those drugs are labeled, if you have a control label, it will reduce the effects and losses due to coccidia, but it will not stop them from showing diarrhea or diarrhea with blood. Where if you have a prevention label, that label, if you're feeding that optimum labeled dose, then they should not break with blood or diarrhea. Both drugs, whether it's a prevention drug or control drug, will increase your performance in the face of coccidia. It's a matter of how much will it increase, and is the drug working for you if it shows bloody diarrhea. So it's a matter of understanding the label, not getting caught in this thing, who's good and who's bad.
And with that, did you mention that there are some drugs that are for food and some that are for water? And is there an understanding of what are some actual differences versus just how they're transported to the cattle?
Yeah, that the ones for feed, and actually all the products, whether it's Decox or Rumensin or Bovatec or Corid, and Monovet, they all have a food or feed form, and you can feed that in mixing a complete feed, or you can make a supplement that maybe you top dress on that. So, and the bottom line to remember about feed additives is coccidia drugs are dose dependent. So if you're going to feed it in there, you need to know that average weight of the animal, and you need to know how much they are eating so you can mix in the right amount of drug. Then the other form, and the one that has a water-soluble form, is Corid. Has both a water-soluble powder and then 9.6% solution to go into water. That drug is another good drug where people will tend to use it more for two reasons. One is it's the only one that's got a treatment level, which is a higher level once you've had a break. The other is when you have coccidia, that intestines is hurting when their parasites are growing in there, so they don't want to eat as bad. Where you may have that opportunity, they will go ahead and drink. So having that advantage of having both water and feed forms there.
Joe, as we're thinking about this disease, any final thoughts you'd like to share with cattle producers?
A thing that we talked about, and I say multiple times, most time I'm out there, 95% of your production losses is in subclinical. And what I mean by that, I can walk into the pen of calves and be a smart aleck and say, yeah, those have coccidia, because I know 100% do. But the reality is they are going to look normal, and they're going to have reasonably good gains on that. But if you get a good anticoccidial management program, even on those normal-looking calves, you will get increased performance.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Okay, thank you.
That was Senior Veterinarian with Huvepharma, Joe Dedrickson, and he was recently a presenter at Kansas State University's Beef Stocker Unit Field Day. If you have more questions about coccidiosis for Joe, you can reach out to him via email at joe.dedrickson@huvepharma.us. Again, that is JOE.DEDRICKSON at HUVEPHARMA.US. I will link this contact information in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll have this week's horticultural segment. We're now cutting to that short break.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. It can be difficult in Kansas to have plants that provide year-round color and interest, but evergreens are an option. For this month's K-State Garden Hour, K-State woody ornamental specialist Dr. Jason Griffin covers which evergreens will perform best.
Conifers are obviously very important for us. They moderate the weather. They're great windbreaks for soil erosion. They help farmers when cows are calving, helps prevent the wind chills, cuts down on energy bills in your house. There's just lots of great things. Not to mention they're pretty awesome in the landscape as well. So we're interested in conifers that do work for us. And we have, over the years, done several different observation type conifer studies, looking at different conifers that we've gotten from nurseries across the country, planted them and watched them. And as you know, our climate around here is very, very challenging. No two winters are alike. No two summers are alike. So watching a tree for 3 years means nothing. We've got to get, a decade under our belt in order to experience the dramatic climate events that we get around here. So it's kind of what we're going to be talking about today is sort of a summary of lots of the different conifer projects we've been doing here for the last 20 some years. One of them that has been a perennial success for us is a United States native, white fir. It's native to the western United States, the Rocky Mountains, basically from the Canadian border to the Mexican border. Has a nice wide range, and there are seed sources that tend to They have different looks. Some of them are more blue, some are more green, some have improved cold hardiness. So where you get your seed from makes a difference with these. We have had pretty good success with these over the years. Cedars, they are an interesting group. And I would say if you are interested in conifers, that this would be a group of trees that you might be interested in if you are a collector. I would not venture down the true cedar path for windbreak, for widespread use, but for ornamental use, for selected locations, you can have mixed success with these. They are known for their drought tolerance. They're known for their heat tolerance, which is great for us. They are less known for their cold tolerance. So on a really, really record-setting type cold, we could have some issues, but it's rare. Normally, we do not see cold damage with Atlas cedar. Arizona cypress is one of our favorites here, and we like Arizona cypress because of its heat and drought tolerance, and it's attractive besides that. There's several cultivars out on the market, but what you get is a big, evergreen, large shrub, small tree that gives you a nice screen. It is native basically along the Mexican, New Mexico, Arizona border. It barely even comes into the United States. So, I mean, it is really tolerant of heat and drought. Eastern red cedar, which brings mixed emotions for lots of people. It is tough. It'll survive anything. You know, the problem is it produces seed and the birds like to eat the seed and the birds deposit the seed. And then you got Eastern red cedar coming up in your pasture, in your rangeland where you don't want it. So there's issues with it, but there are some ornamental cultivars I want to look at. And again, if you need a windbreak, it's still our go-to. Spruce. Spruce is one of those plants that I have mixed feelings on in this part of the state. Spruce is a nice little landscape plant for a few years. When it gets 12, 15 years old, all of a sudden there are some issues that roll in. There's some needle cast, there's some canker, and they start to go downhill. Southern part of the state, generally don't recommend blue spruce, Colorado blue spruce. I see too many of them in various states of decline to recommend them. Let's talk pines for a little bit. It's a huge genus, over 100 species. There's a ton of diversity, native around the world. So you get all kinds of shapes, growth habits, colors, cold hardiness, heat tolerance. And for us, conifers, Eastern white pine, Southwestern white pine, Austrian pine, they're some of the fastest growing conifers for us. But in our experience, we have seen pine wilt disease in almost all true pines. So we recommend with real caution. Just know what you're getting to up front. But we're going to continue trying conifers of obscure species, varieties, and check with us from time to time and see what's working for us and what isn't. And let our failures be your knowledge base and let our successes be your successes.
That's K-State Woody Ornamental Specialist Dr. Jason Griffin with information on which evergreens will perform best in Kansas. To view his complete presentation, do an online search for K-State Garden Hour. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.